will know me. I'm Chris, and I'm one of the leaders at the Beacon Church. And we're putting on this grief webinar because we recognise that there will be some people, some of us here on this call who are grieving and are looking for some help and support, or we will know people who are grieving and we want to understand better, and they want to understand better how they might help and support others. And that's fine reason for being here too. Or you might just want to listen in case for another time, then it applies to you or to someone else. So whether you're part of the Beacon Church or you're just visiting us, we're really pleased to have you along. It's great to have you. And I really hope that you find it useful. So as a church, the Beacon Church, we believe that God is absolutely interested in our total well-being. He's interested in everything about us, our physical, mental and spiritual health. And he longs just to share his love for us in all circumstances, even when we're grieving, even when there seems to be no answers. God wants to share that love with us. In Matthew, in the Bible, in the New Testament, in Matthew 5, verse 4, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." And Jesus himself wept when he heard of the death of his friend Lazarus. So Jesus has experienced grief himself in the loss of a loved one. I often find, I said this in the previous webinar that I was on, but often find the Psalms are a great place to look for God's comfort. But also the Psalms show the reality of human feelings, and they recognise situations as they are. Great verse, Psalm 34 verse 18 says this: "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." He's close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. And if that's how you're feeling tonight, just brokenhearted or crushed in spirit or anywhere along the way to that path of feeling like that, we hope that you will find some support through this webinar. Now, I should say that we're not here as a group of experts, but we're just here as those who have suffered grief ourselves and have got some experience in supporting those who are grieving. And we wanted to share that experience with you. So perhaps let me map out how the session's going to go, how it will pan out, or at least how I think it's going to pan out. Never quite know. We're going to have a short presentation from Duncan. So Duncan Leake, he's sitting up there in his blue shirt. He's going to give us a short presentation. And Duncan's a retired Church of England minister, but not a retired elder at the Beacon, one of our senior leaders. And he's going to speak from his heart, just from his own experience of supporting others and the same going through grief himself. Then we're going to have a discussion or a question and answer session. And this is the bit that depends on you. So in that discussion, Duncan's going to be joined on the panel by Alex. So Alex Harris, who's our senior minister from the Beacon, again with a lot of experience of supporting those who are grieving. And we've also got Ashley Eberson. Give us a wave, Ashley. Yeah, lovely. So Ashley works at the Signpost Centre in Stafford. She loves to just love and serve people, and she's studying to be a counsellor, and she's got some insights that she can share in terms of grieving as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Duncan, and we'll listen to what he's got to say. Thanks, Duncan.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Okay, well, just looking around the screen, I can see straight away that every one of us has something in common. And that is simply the truth that we share, that every one of us will experience loss. It's part, isn't it, of what it is to be human. And grief, well, that's just the word that we use to describe our reaction to and our journey through that loss. You know, the word grief, it comes from the same root as the word gravity. And just like gravity, grief can pull us down, can weigh us down. Sometimes it can make us feel as if we haven't got the energy to do anything. Now, as I said, loss is a normal part of human experience. All sorts of little losses are part of our journey. As our children grow, we lose the baby, we lose the toddler, we lose the child they once were, and we enter into a new kind of relationship with them. As we age, we lose all sorts of things. A quick glance at me shows you that. There can be changes in our physical capabilities as well as our physical appearance. But in a real sense, we lose the physical person that we once were. We lose touch with friends. We lose touch with colleagues. Maybe it's a previous workplace. We lose a relationship, maybe because of a breakdown of communication. Sometimes in close relationships, it might be the abusive or controlling behavior of a partner or the faithlessness of a partner. And we are left with a sense of loss, missing what might have been. You know, I remember once I was chatting with someone who'd recently been divorced, and they said to me that now they could never have what their parents had had, a lifelong relationship of trust with someone. And they were grieving the loss of what they'd hoped for. Because I suppose the thing about grief is it reminds us that there are some things that can't be fixed. There are some things that are beyond our control. And to grieve a loss, to feel the weight of it, well, that's normal. So important we remember that. And it's part of what makes us human. I mean, if we didn't value anyone, if we didn't value anything in life, then we'd never have a reason to grieve, would we? But because we do value the people around us, because we do value relationships, because we do value the life that we live, well, then when we're faced with loss, we grieve. And that loss, doesn't it evoke all sorts of different feelings in us? Feelings of loneliness as we miss the companionship or the friendship of people and situations we once knew. Feelings of regret. We find ourselves going over and over the past and saying, if only I'd done this, if only this hadn't happened. And sometimes we ask those if only questions, and that gives rise to feelings of guilt as we start to blame ourselves. Or maybe sometimes anger, or maybe that anger is directed towards ourselves or towards others. And those feelings and emotions that are part of our reaction to loss, we can change from one to the other in an instant. And this mix of emotions and feelings, it's what we call grief. It's what can weigh us down as we grieve for a life that we once knew. I suppose in the lockdown, there must have been many who felt that sort of grief. A sense that we've lost our way of living and relating to one another that once we just took for granted. I wonder if it's just worth noting, just for a moment, that sometimes loss brings new opportunities. I mean, during the lockdown, there'll be many parents who've spent more quality time with their children. There'll have been many pressures for families, but I know that lots of folk also have a story to tell of how their family life has been strengthened, not weakened through the lockdown. And for some people, the loss of an old routine of life has been a creative, liberating experience. But for others, the experience of loss in lockdown has been anything but liberating. It's been destructive. The loss of work or social routines has been so difficult, so demoralizing, and the loss of a job, the loss of an income means the loss of a future. When something maybe we've been working for or saving for or looking forward to, it's all been snatched away. And some losses are so great that they change everything for us. The loss of a loved one, the loss of a relationship that really, really matters. I counted up yesterday, it's 30 years since I was ordained as a minister in the Anglican Church. And over that time, I've conducted well over 1,000 funerals. Every one, I hope, was different, because every one was a unique remembering of a unique individual whose loss left a unique gap in the lives of those around them. And I suppose all that's meant that I've had a lot of experience of being with people who are grieving. But, you know, it's not made me an expert in grief. The only person's grief that I have become expert in is my own. And I think that's true for all of us. When it comes to making our journey through loss, we can help one another, we can talk with one another, and as I hope we'll hear this evening, talking and sharing experiences, it's so important. We can learn from one another's experiences, because our journey through grief might take us past landmarks that have been noticed by others. Landmarks like those feelings of anger or guilt or regret or loneliness or hopelessness. But though we might pass some of the same landmarks, my journey through loss is my journey, and your journey is yours. And especially that's true when we're dealing with the loss of people who we've loved so much. As I said, every loss is unique, and so too is the way in which each one of us makes our journey through it. And I just wanted to share just 2 moments in my story, because I do think that as we learn to talk about our own journeys, that helps us to come to terms with that loss and not to be burdened and weighed down by it. And I hope this evening we can help each other by sharing stories. But here's something about me. It was Christmas Day. The children were at home with my wife, Pam, and I was in the hospital. My mum had been staying with us. She hadn't been well, and it was only 6 months since my father had died. Well, on Christmas Eve, the doctor came to see Mum, and then he made a phone call, and a short while later, she was taken downstairs and out to the waiting ambulance. And with all the ignorance and confidence of youth, I assumed she'd have some more treatment and then come back home to us again. But now I was in hospital. My brothers were there with me. We were sort of gathered round her bedside. Mum was in a coma. You know, the things that stick in your mind. I remember one of my brothers making a sort of joke saying, well, this will be a conversation stopper when we go back to work. And everybody says, did you have a good Christmas? We stayed with my mum until she died late that Christmas Day morning. And I remember at the time that I said very little about how I was feeling, if anything. And I'm not sure I was able to feel much at all. I was numb. I mean, Pam was great. She gave our children the news that Grandma had died. And I went back home and I don't know, somehow we picked up all the usual routines of life in a household with 2 young children. I didn't pray. I talked to God. I didn't even complain to him or ask why. I mean, that's because me and God just weren't that close at the time anyway. It just wasn't really that near. I didn't cry at the funeral. I think just 6 months after my father's funeral, there was so much painful familiarity in the proceedings, I just shut down emotionally. But I do remember being taken by surprise many months later. We were coming back from a family holiday. And as we got to just a few miles away from home, I started to say to the kids in the back, shall we call into? And then I stopped because I realised that we couldn't call into Grandma's on the way home anymore. And that moment, months later, was when I felt the sharp pain of loss in a way that I hadn't earlier. See, grief can be like that. Sometimes we can be overwhelmed by grief at the time of our loss. And sometimes we can be ambushed by the pain of grief, just as I was driving home that day. And the other thing I wanted to say is that sometimes we can be so slow, I'm talking about myself here, can be so slow to understand the grief journey that we're on. Now, I discovered that about myself a few years later. I was ordained. I'd just been ordained as a vicar and sent off to Carlisle as a new curate. And one of the first things I had to do in the first couple of weeks was to begin to visit people who'd been bereaved and to help them to prepare for a funeral. And my first experiences were all of people who had died at what we would say is a good age. They were a good age. And I remember being with a lady who was absolutely distraught at the loss of her mother. This lady was in her 70s and her mother had been in her late 90s. And she expressed her pain and feelings of loss. And she said things like, life's not fair. My mum shouldn't have died yet. This shouldn't have happened. I shouldn't be going through this. And as I sat with her, I felt a real resentment. That's the only word. A real resentment growing up inside of me. My mum had died when she was only in her early 60s. That's what I was thinking. You should be grateful that you had your mum for so long. And that moment was when I learned another lesson about grief. You see, if we don't make our journey through grief properly, well, then grief hangs around to shape our reactions to other people and other situations that we encounter in life. And it doesn't always shape them in a good way. See, instead of feeling compassion, my own feelings of anger at my own loss had made me unable to appreciate, unable to understand the grief being experienced by another person. And that moment of understanding was an important moment for me on my journey as I let go of that anger. And I was further helped as I really deliberately, intently listened to the lady who was speaking and understood that loss is loss for everyone, however, whenever it comes. Grief is deep and profound for all of us. We can't construct a sliding scale and place ourselves on it somewhere. Grief is grief. So where are you on your journey? I mean, there is good news. The journey through grief can be made. And we can arrive somewhere new, not the same, but still good. I wonder what experiences of loss have been most significant for you. What landmarks have you passed on your grief journey? You know, those landmarks of loneliness or guilt or regret or anger or hopelessness. What landmarks are you looking at right now?
Okay, thanks, Duncan. Thanks for your personal testimony as well. Just really touching and yeah, good. So what we're going to do is just to open up a bit of a discussion. So Alex and Ashley and Duncan are going to contribute. I've got some good questions coming in, so that's really good. Got lots to go through, got lots to go at, some challenging ones here, panel. So get ready. So here's the first question, but don't feel free just to keep on typing in questions because you know there's plenty of time for us to go at. So first question: I have a good friend who lost her partner 5 years ago and really struggles, saying that sometimes it's like he only died yesterday. Most of the time I sit and listen and support her, but sometimes I wonder, am I doing enough for her? Should I be helping her more to look forward to the future? So someone with a good friend, lost a partner 5 years ago, really struggles, saying it's only like yesterday he died. This person wonderfully sits and listens and supports, but sometimes wonders, is she doing enough or he doing enough? Should I be helping her more to look forward to the future? Who wants to start on that one?
I'll say something to that. I personally think that is the absolute best thing that you can be doing for your friend. Grief needs to be witnessed. Grief is a story to tell. And I think allowing somebody to just share their experience and you just simply listening is the absolute best thing that you can do, because that's their way of moving through their grief, is by sharing it and telling that story and remembering her husband. You know, she doesn't want to forget him. She wants to remember. She wants to share those memories with other people as well. So I think that's the best thing you can do, and I would just encourage you to keep doing that. And you don't need to do anything else. Just listen, and that's the best thing you can do.
Thanks, Ashley.
I think, Chris, I'd wholeheartedly agree with Ashley there, really. And I was thinking, Chris, you quoted, I think it was Psalm 34:18, wasn't it? The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and through other people, actually. So I think it's marvellous to sit with someone and hear the stories and the retelling of the stories, and there'll be tears and laughters, I'm sure, recounted in that. But I also sort of recognise as well, one of the other things the Bible says is that we're to be sorrowful, obviously sorrowful, but also always rejoicing. That the Bible doesn't wear rose-tinted glasses, it doesn't whistle in the dark. It knows the reality of life, sorrowful, but also encourages us to recognise that's only ever one thread, however big and dominating a thread it feels. It's only ever one thread of the fabric of our lives. And there'll be other threads which are bright and colourful and have life to them and joy to them. And perhaps another role of a friend is just to help someone see the other threads that are wrapped round in the fabric of their life, the brighter ones as well. So there's something of a both and, I think, the Bible, and I guess experience, those of us who have grieved, know that experience that you can cry and laugh in the same day. And sometimes there's guilt with that.
Same time.
There, isn't it?
Great, thanks, Alex. Anything you want to add, Duncan?
Well, except that I'd say 100% agree with everything Ashley and Alex have said. And I mean, you're obviously, if maybe loneliness is one of the landmarks that lady is standing next to, well then great, because you're being a friend and that's what's needed. It could be good and helpful to listen carefully to what the lady is saying and just notice if there's a particular landmark that she seems to keep going round and round. I mean, are there feelings of guilt or regret or, are there some things that need to be let go of? And maybe just by listening carefully, you may be able to spot if there's something that just keeps on recurring, that she isn't actually speaking out, but just needs to be expressed so that she can move on, maybe find another landmark on her journey. There's no hard and fast rule about how long this journey takes.
No.
Oh, that's great. No, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for that. That's really, really helpful. There's another question, which is kind of on the journey theme as well, really. So this person says that they heard from someone who lost their brother and said this: you actually never move on from such a thing, but you have to move forward. You actually never move on from such a thing, but you have to move forward. And the question is, what do you think is the difference in the kind of quote that's been given? You actually move on from such a thing, but you have to move forward.
Chris, I've certainly found that the idea of moving on, often attached to that is some sense of needing to almost forget or almost, return back to what life was like, just move on from it and pretend it never happened, get life back to normal, which I think is very unhealthy. Whereas moving forward is the recognition that to borrow and slightly twist Duncan's landmark, but to move forward is to recognize that's always going to be a landmark in your life. It's always going to be a significant moment. It's always going to be a pillar there in your life, and it's not to be forgotten. It's not to be whitewashed or ignored, but you can move forward from it or with it. So I think for me that's probably why I'd always encourage people to be really wary of the idea of just move on. No, but you can definitely move forward while needing to recognize the enormity of the experience that you're going forward. I was aware as well, like Duncan said, the word grief and gravity kind of come from the same root. And I have often said to people, when you go through grief, it's almost like a gravity. It's not like a supernova in your life. It's always going to be there, having a pull on you. It's always going to be part of your solar system because it has such weight to it. It's grief, it's gravity, but it doesn't have to be where you stay, but it's always going to mark your journey.
Yeah, thank you. Anything to add?
I mean, yes, I agree with Alex. I think moving on makes a bit sound like you're leaving the past behind or whatever. I mean, in actual fact, isn't it true that the life of everyone who we love and who's loved us, they aren't just part of our life for a while. They shape our life in some way, but not just for a moment. Our experience of life with them has helped to make us the people who we are now. That's why we'll never be shy back from talking about people who we've known and being thankful for them. Yeah. Because our interaction with them has helped to make us the people who we are.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add, Ashley? Or?
I completely agree with what they've both said. Absolutely.
Right. No, that's great. Some questions here, which come from those of us that have a faith. So a couple of questions that are particularly related to that. The first one is this: for those who have faith, how do we teach children about grief and death with biblical integrity? How do we teach children about grief and death with biblical integrity? Who wants to start? Alex, I'm going to come to you.
I think that's a tremendous question. So for those of you who don't know, I've got 4 younger children. So our eldest is 12. So they're all really still young, no teenagers. So we're at that stage of life. So I think, if I may, I'd probably rather just share as a parent more than as a pastor, and just probably say that the 2 things that we try and do with our children around all the big topics of life, not just grief and death, but across the whole spectrum of the big things, is both to do it in a planned and in a spontaneous way, and to try and leverage both. So the spontaneous way is when it comes up, so we've been mostly fortunate. Our boys have mostly been fortunate. They've still got all their grandparents, for example, and things like that. But 2 of them have had children in their classes who have died. And so, that there's a life experience that's a little bit more spontaneous, makes it sound too flippant, but you've obviously not planned that. But obviously they've come home, they've experienced that, and there's conversations that come up at the dinner table or as you're riding bikes or you're driving the car or whatever it might be. And so we try and lean into those moments and just talk honestly and openly, and often those spontaneous moments are not trying to worry about getting the content perfectly right, but just actually talking from the heart and just being open as appropriate with their age. And then there's the more planned moments, which is, for example, more recently, because of events over the last month or so, we've deliberately bought a couple of books recommended by the Black Lives Matter initiative, suitable for their ages. And, we're going to start a little nighttime reading each night, reading a chapter or 2 of these age-appropriate books, about the equality of all life, racism, and these sorts of things. That's much more planned. We've also done that with grief and death. We've found some really good books appropriate for their ages, which we have deliberately, read through and journeyed through with them. So just as a dad, that's how we've tried to do it as parents, recognizing there's the spontaneous and the planned, and you probably need both. And the spontaneous is much more heart to heart, and the planned is much more how do we want to help them think about this? What are the stepping stones in the mystery of grief and death that we want them to have certain in their mind? And so how can we help them engage with that? And for us, it's mostly reading books with them and then talking about that. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's just how we have chosen to do it.
I'm sure that's really helpful, Alex. And I particularly like what you said, that in those spontaneous moments, you don't need to worry about getting it absolutely right. It's more like heart response, and that's really. Ashley, do you want to? No, that's fine. There's the other questions. Anything to add, Duncan?
Uh,
It doesn't have to be. I've got
yeah,
plenty of questions.
well, I don't know how to put it really. I mean, nothing that would really be of help, except that as I ponder on how useless I was in handling the grief that my kids felt, I mean, many years ago. And as I say, before I was really knew God as well as I do now, hopefully. But I didn't understand at the time the impact of a child who's, on a child who's just about 4, of losing 2 grandparents in the space of 6 months, who'd been actually, he'd spent every day of the school year with them. And at that sort of age, I think children can experience emotions that they can't even verbalize. They can't put words. And I think some of those feelings of grief they had to deal with when they were older, much older, actually. I think that I'd like to think that if the same thing happened now, I'd be more aware about how to give appropriate support to very young children who are grieving but can't even name what it is they're feeling.
Yeah. Could I just pick up on that comment by Duncan? Just if I may, Chris, one of the things we've also realised with our boys, we're a bit slow to realise it, but is over the last 2 or 3 months of lockdown and isolation and being away of school, they are grieving. They need to be helped to grieve a huge amount of things. Hannah and I were really too slow to realise it, but they need help to do that. I think this is true for us as adults as well, that we perhaps aren't realising just how much we have lost. Grief is because something we loved or appreciated or valued has been torn away from us, and almost all of us have experienced that. But with our boys, one of them particularly, who's normally, he's just super steady, like he's our easy boy, if that makes sense, and he's not been over the last few months, and we weren't quite sure why. He was very emotional, the rest of it. But just in the last couple of weeks, realizing he's missing stuff more than the others, he's grieving stuff, but he's 10, unable to give it structure and shape, is one of the things we just do at night. I just do it with him, just quietly when he goes to bed, is ask him what's making him sad, and help him to articulate what is making him sad, and give it words. And often by giving it words, that's a big beginning on the journey. I think this was Ashley's point earlier. It's a big beginning on the journey. So for those of us with kids, you've probably been better than I was, but just being aware that they're probably grieving a lot of stuff and unable to even realize they are, and might need a little bit of help to put that into words.
Yeah. I think that's great, Alex. I think actually that's helpful, for all of us, because those situations, and sometimes we can't put our finger on it. I've got one other question on faith here, so particularly to challenge the ministers, I think. So here we go. Where is it? How can I respond when someone realizes I'm a person of faith and they are not, but they want to know if their loved one would go to heaven? So someone knows that you've got a faith, that you believe in God and heaven, but they don't, and they want to know. What would you say? How can we help them?
I think I said earlier on, over the years, I've done lots and lots of funerals. Sometimes I've been able to celebrate and share with everyone the faith that the person who's died had. Right? That's a great thing to be able to do. Sometimes it's clear that the person didn't have any particular faith that was known to others, the family or anyone. What I can do then is to celebrate the person to whom God gave life, to celebrate every single sign of goodness and joy that was part of that person's life, because every good gift is a gift from God. He doesn't just bless people who believes in him, he blesses everybody. And so I can celebrate the person's life. I can celebrate the love that God had for that person from the very, very beginning of their life right up until the very, very end. God never, ever stopped loving them. And we can celebrate that. And I can tell everyone about the promise that Jesus has made, that if we know him as a friend now, then we're going to know him forever. What I can't do is God's job for him. It's God's job to judge. It's God who knows our hearts, and God is always good, and his judgment is always just. And I can't say to somebody to relatives who are grieving at someone who was never a church member, didn't know, I can't answer that question and say, well, they're in heaven now. I can, God's good. God has cared for your loved one all through his life. And that's the only thing that I can say. Usually, when people are asking that it's an emotion, it's doubt about the future. They're not looking for a theological answer. Before lockdown, most times people were looking for a hug and for somebody to tell their story to, which I'm sure is one of the things that's made this whole process of grieving through lockdown so terribly difficult. That sort of, all the normal human interaction and contact from situations where this grief is missing, and that is so hard. But I understand the question, but I haven't found an experience that people have badgered me for a theological answer, because it's not really a theological question they're asking. It's a cry of pain and concern. And what I have discovered is that time and time again, God has met with people through that experience, and the relatives of the person who died have discovered a new peace and a new relationship with God time and time again.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a lovely answer from Duncan. I've had to discipline myself as someone who loves to have answers. I've had to discipline myself to try and respond with questions, not answers. And I think I've learned when someone says that to me, not actually to try and answer a little bit like Duncan is saying there, but to say, I'm really glad you asked that, but why do you ask? Why is that your question? Because actually there's about 15 different answers to that same question, exactly the same words, depending on why someone has asked it. And just like Duncan says, my experience, not always, but probably 8 out of 10 times, is when you say, why'd you ask that? Someone will just burst into tears, or just want to have someone who will listen to them talk about their loved one and tell stories. That's where their heart is. Every now and again, someone might immediately get angry, and you can tell actually they were asking the question because they needed to express anger and hope that you might, give them the opportunity. Or, once or twice it has been an intellectual or theological question sometimes, but 8 times out of 10, it's just someone saying, I want someone who I think will listen and stand with me, and if you know them, to hug them. So I think for me, I've just learned to say, when someone asks any of the big questions actually about life and faith, is to say, I'm really glad you asked that. Why do you ask? Help me understand why that's important to you, and then we'll journey together with it. And then the second thing I've also learned to say is, actually, I can't comment on someone else's relationship with God. Probably someone I never knew. I can't. But what I can do is I can tell you about my relationship with God and the offer he makes to you to have a relationship with him. But I'm not going to get drawn on talking about someone I probably don't even know, and certainly not about something as significant as whether they had a faith in Jesus, but I would be delighted to talk about the God that I know and the invitation that he makes to you. So I don't know if those two reflections, ask the question why, and then, don't be drawn to speculate about someone, but talk about what you do know, the wonderful love of a God who offers that to everybody.
That's great. No, that's really helpful. I've got a question. I've got a comment here from someone, which is from their own experience, answering this question. So it says, when my mum died, my dad was desperate to know if she'd gone to heaven. She had never openly had a faith, but one of the most helpful things for Dad was when the person preparing him for the funeral said, no one ever knows what is on a person's heart in their dying days, and whether or not they prayed to. And I think that's true, isn't it? You never know where people are at the end. Okay, I'm going to move us on. Here's a question about an individual. How can you recognize grief within yourself? How can you recognize grief within yourself? Might like to go at Ashley?
Yeah, I think some of the biggest signs of grieving yourself is if, you're waking up in the morning and you're finding it difficult to get out of bed. If you're finding it difficult to focus on anything, if you're finding it difficult to, retain information, like if you read something and you're like, and normally you don't have to go back and read it, but you're finding you have to go back and read it a few times because you're not quite grasping what's in front of you. And grief is going to look different for everybody. It's not the same. So, there's some different stages of grief that they talk about, but grief isn't linear. And so, you might be okay one day and feel fine, and then the next day you're not okay again. So that would be some signs for me that I've learned that would be, okay, something's not quite right. And then ask yourself, maybe what's gone on, because grief isn't always a loss of a person, especially in this time that we're in. It's just the loss of normality and what used to be. And I think a lot of people are grieving what used to be. And the world will probably never be exactly like it used to be again. And we have to grieve that, we don't know when we'll ever be able to go out and not have to wear masks again, when we'll be able to fly on a plane, when we'll be able to go visit family in another country, that, and when you do, it probably won't look like it used to. So yeah, I think it's completely normal. And yeah, you have to just allow yourself to grieve, and then name it is the biggest thing. Is if you think that's what's happening, you need to name it so that you can feel it, and allow yourself to feel that. Don't try to push it away. Allow yourself to feel whatever it is. If you just need a day to sit and do nothing because you're grieving, allow yourself to do that and know that it's okay.
Good. No, that's good. Thank you. Great. Anything anyone wants to add? No. Okay. I've got another one. So this is about how do you practically support? We did begin to touch on this earlier on. How do you practically support people who are grieving? I think we have started to touch on this one, but any other advice really, or help from experience?
There's probably as many different answers to that as there are many different types of grief. I think Duncan made this comment when he was speaking that actually we're all individuals, so our grief is individual. So probably what it looks like to support someone is very individual. But the thing that immediately springs into my mind, again, just from experience, is presence is massive. Being with someone is massive. But I think what often happens, particularly when the grief is recognized, it's because a loved one has died. It's not nuanced, everyone knows that you are grieving, is in the first week, the first month, the first 6 months, there's lots of support, there's lots of people going round, there's lots of presents and those sorts of things. And then that drifts off and stops and is sort of forgotten. And so sometimes it's in the, if you like, the second wave of someone's grief, if that's the right turn of phrase. Sometimes one of the most important things to do is to reach out to someone actually 6 months, a year, 3 years after they've experienced a loss, and reach out to them with the expectation they are still grieving, and just be present. And I've tried to do that, with particularly friends and people I've known or people in church life that they've lost a loved one. I just try and have a note in my diary every 6 months or on an anniversary or whatever it might be, and just reach out to them in that moment, in recognition that they're still going to be grieving in some way, shape or form. So that is one of a dozen or more answers to the question, Chris, but I guess I'm saying it needs stretching it over a much longer period than we perhaps would initially think.
That's great.
Yeah.
Really, really helpful. Anything to add from Duncan or Ashley? I've got one final question. I know times we're up to 8:30, so we've got a final question that we can go at, and it's particular for this time, under COVID. And it's this really, do the panel have thoughts on what to do for those who've lost someone in death through COVID and not being able to say a proper goodbye? So, it's really tough, isn't it, for people? What are the panel's thoughts to try and help people think through that?
I'll just make a quick comment and then I'll duck out, because I've obviously not learned the lesson to not answer questions. But during the first 6 weeks or so of the lockdown, I was helping as a chaplain at the hospital because they had a gap. So I did the last rites for I think it was 8 individuals who died of COVID, or at least they died with COVID, whether from or other things, but they died with COVID. And so what I've tried to do is I took the details of any family members that were known, and they allowed me to take those details. And just this week, I've contacted those family members and said, if you would like, we could now do something out in the open, maybe in a favourite place, maybe in your back garden, within the restrictions as they exist, but maybe we could do something to mark a moment that you missed, but was very significant and meaningful. And I've already, this was only yesterday, I sent the messages. I've already heard back from all but one of those contacts, all positive, and saying I would really like to try and organise something. So that's just an example. That's a privilege of my position, obviously, and the relationship I have, and it is a huge privilege. But I think there probably are equivalents we could all make in terms of just reaching out to folk and recognising. And certainly I would be delighted to, if you know someone and you'd like to reach out to them because they've experienced a loss. And actually sometimes people need the recognised professional. I know that sounds terrible, but to help give words and give shape to their grief and their mourning. So I'd encourage you to reach out to anybody who's lost someone in far from ideal situations. And if I could help with that, or we at Beacon Church could help with that in creating a space to grieve, to mourn, to celebrate. So I think there's options that we could do, but reaching out, I think, is the key thing. Reaching out.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's excellent, Alex. That's really, really good. And of course, there will be, next year, there'll be a lot of anniversaries. And, or there'll be future birthdays. There will be other moments in time that are really significant for folk who are grieving. And maybe those moments in time will be times when we will be able to gather together and to remember the person who's died.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Alex and Duncan have said. And for somebody who maybe has lost a loved one and hasn't been able to commemorate them in the way that they would normally do it, the only suggestion that I've heard of is it could be helpful to maybe plant something in your garden if you have the space, or buy a rose bush for your house, or like a little rose, or something that you can look at to help you remember them in your own way in your home where you are now. It just might bring some comfort. It's some ideas I've heard of, or painting if you paint, or put something up either in your garden or around your house that will help you remember them in a way that is best for you. And that's it's not easy, but that's the best suggestion I could give at the minute.
Oh, I
I
think
hope
that's
that's
a really
helpful.
really lovely suggestion, actually. Really nice. Thank you. Okay, so we're coming into land now. Thank you for those contributions. I will, just before we close, I'll come back to you, the panel, just if there's any one last thought that you'd like to leave people with. I talked on the last webinar about just leaving a nugget to take away. If there's one thing that you want people to remember, if they forget everything else, what would it be in terms of supporting them in grief or supporting others? But Chrissy, I don't know if are you able to just share what resources we've got as a church? I know you were thinking about putting the screen up, so I know Alex has already said that he'd be delighted to help people. We have got other pastors available, so obviously Chrissy's a lady pastor, so that might be more appropriate in some instances, and we have other Ali's on the call, I see, and others. So, but that is there that people are available to support if you want. Chrissy, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'm just trying to get this to come up. I'll share my screen. What we've put together on our church website. I think you should be able to see it there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just come up. Yeah.
So this is thebeaconchurch.com//grief. And what we've done is we put here, we're recording this webinar for the people, only showing the people who spoke, and we'll put that here in place of the advertisement in a week or so. And then we're collecting, right now we have a few resources. So there's a short video to watch on how to help a friend. There's some podcasts, there's some more YouTube, there's some websites, books. We've got a few more resources as well to add to it, but we're going to collate it all here on this one page. We also have a page on well-being that's linked here. We did a well-being webinar with lots and lots of resources. So we'll continue to add to these. So I'd say that's the biggest thing we're doing, is just trying to put together spaces for resources. Maybe I'll get from Alex if he has some children's book suggestions that he's used with his boys for parents. Just so you have one place that you could go, that either for you or if you wanted to refer to someone. Yeah, I think that's the main thing. And there is an email address on there. So like Alex said, if you wanted to contact Alex or any other pastor or leader at Beacon Church, Duncan as well, you can just, this email here, info@thebeaconchurch, and we can connect you to whoever you need to.
Right. Absolutely, that's brilliant. No, that's really good. So a one-stop shop there for finding some resource. So I'm just going to hand back to the panel then for just a brief comment. And you might not have anything you want to share, but if there was one thing that you wanted to leave folk with in terms of thinking or mulling over, then what would it be? Who's going to start?
I don't mind starting. I think for me, grief is not linear, and you can feel many different emotions at one time, and so just to remember that, it isn't. There's no right or wrong way to grieve, and everybody grieves differently. So just to remember that as well.
No, that's great. Thank you. That's really helpful. Duncan?
Yeah, don't be afraid to allow people to talk about their feelings of loss. Sometimes in all sorts of ways, often with our body language or whatever, we shut down conversations, either through, say, our body language, or sometimes just through the way we dive in straight away and start telling our own experiences. Just be ready to listen and give people permission to talk about their own sense of loss.
Thank you. Great.
And I think mine, Chris, would be that grief is bad, but it's not only bad. Actually the experience of grief for your own heart has positive outcomes to it, and the experience of grief equipping you and enabling you to love and care for others, perhaps at a future point, has some positive things. So grief is bad because it's the pain of a loss, but it's not only bad. And sometimes that hope is important when the pain is hard.
Okay, that's really helpful too. Thank you. Well, look, can I just say a huge thank you to Duncan, Ashley and Alex. It's very difficult to be put on the spot like that, and appreciate all your sharing, your personal stories and your experience that you've had. I hope that it's been helpful to everybody. Thank you to everybody else for contributing. You know, it's been great to have lots of questions come in, so I hope that you found it helpful. And remember those resources on the church, on the Beacon Church website. And you know, if you want support, then reach out to us, and we'll get in touch. Okay, so thanks ever so much, everyone, and we'll say goodbye. Thank you.